But Theodore Roosevelt knew that once the war broke out in Europe, here was a chance for a president to be really considered great. And it wasn't him. It was Woodrow Wilson. And he was absolutely convinced that Woodrow Wilson was utterly unqualified to be a wartime president, whereas he, Theodore Roosevelt, would have made a great wartime president. Or so he thought. So, Theodore Roosevelt was very bitter. And when Wilson called for this 1918 congressional election to be a referendum on the war, a referendum on Wilson's approach to foreign policy, and Wilson lost, Theodore Roosevelt was absolutely, as he would have put it, delighted. And he went so far. It's hard to believe. It's hard to believe that a former president would do such a thing, especially somebody like Theodore Roosevelt. He wrote personal letters to the leaders of the British government and the French government, precisely those diplomats who would be meeting Wilson in Paris to design the post-war world. And what Roosevelt said is, just to remind you that President Wilson does not have the support of the American people. That if this were a parliamentary system, President Wilson would have been repudiated and thrown out of office. What Roosevelt was doing was inviting the leaders of Britain and France to sandbag Wilson at Paris. If anybody had done this to Roosevelt himself when Roosevelt was president, Roosevelt would have certainly found occasion to arrest that person and to try him for treason. But this is what Theodore Roosevelt was doing to Woodrow Wilson. So bitter were the feelings. Wilson brought the Treaty of Versailles home, delivered it to the Senate, where it fell into the hands of Henry Cabot Lodge. Henry Cabot Lodge, for the reasons that I suggested, refused to cooperate with Wilson's world vision and did his best to destroy the idea of the League of Nations, to block American participation, membership in the League of Nations, and to scuttle the Treaty of Versailles. Lodge realized that American support for the war was dwindling the farther the war receded into the past. Americans that entered the war with high hopes had fought the war with great enthusiasm. But the war had ended in November of 1918. By now, the Paris Peace Conference lasted till the summer of 1919. Lodge was determined to drag out discussion, consideration of the treaty. Of course, like any treaty, the Treaty of Versailles had to receive a two-thirds majority in the U.S. Senate. And so Lodge took the position, this is a momentous time in American history. This is one of the biggest decisions we in the Senate will be ever asked to make. And so, to drag out the event, Lodge insisted on reading the entire treaty, word by slow word. It took 3 weeks. And in that 3 weeks, American interest wandered elsewhere. Americans were already thinking about post-war Reconstruction, how they could get back to their ordinary lives. Lodge realized that the essence of this treaty was Article 10 of the Covenant of the League of Nations, which pledged members of the League of Nations to use all means, including military force if necessary, to preserve the peace. And Lodge realized that after every war the United States fights, there's a certain kind of war weariness, a moral exhaustion that sets in. And Lodge realized that the farther the war receded into the past, the less likely Americans would be to sign up for future wars. And he played on this theme. He says, we're signing up for future wars. This isn't an end to wars. Wilson had talked of World War I as the war to end all wars. And Lodge said, what evidence is there that this is the war to end all wars? Wars have always been with us. And wars always will be with us. The question is, do we want to make other people's wars our own? And if we sign this treaty, if we accept this treaty, that's what we'll be doing. And for a while it looked as though the pendulum was swinging in Lodge's direction. Lodge brought in all sorts of witnesses to testify against the treaty, to testify against Wilson, to explain from the inside of Wilson's entourage at Paris how President Wilson had made these compromises, made these bargains with the British and the French to get their support. And things didn't look good for Wilson until September of 1919, when Wilson decided that he was going to have to make the case for the Treaty of Versailles and for his vision of American responsibility for world order to the American people. This has been the trump card of presidents since maybe Thomas Jefferson, definitely since Andrew Jackson, since the time when the American people began to realize or began to think that the presidency was peculiarly their office. The President of the United States is the only elected official who is potentially elected by all the people of the United States. I should carve out a minor exception here for the Vice President, who falls in the same category, but you get the difference between the two. No senator speaks for the entire country, no representative, no governor. The President does. And the President can, under certain circumstances, go over the heads of Congress to the American people. Now, just because the American people support the President doesn't mean that a die-hard oppositionist like Henry Cabot Lodge would change his vote. But Wilson knew that American politics is always played out at the margin. It's not the bitter enders, it's not the committed, zealots whose minds are going to be changed. It's the folks who are sitting on the fence, the ones who are thinking, well, I got to run for re-election in 1920. And if I oppose the president on, if it turns out to be a popular measure, then voters, in fact, might decide on balance they'd rather have somebody else. In 1919, the only way a president could get his message out to the people was to go to the people himself. If Wilson had lived 20 years later, even 10 years later, he wouldn't have had to leave Washington. He could speak over the radio, as Franklin Roosevelt would do. He could reach Americans in their homes by never leaving the White House. But in 1919, radio was beginning to be a substitute for telegraphy, but it wasn't yet a mass medium. If Wilson wanted to reach the people, he had to go to the people, and so he did. He went off on a train journey around the nation, leaving Washington, swinging out across the upper Midwest, through Colorado, out to Washington, down to California, and headed back toward Washington. And in every state where he gave speeches, he summoned Americans to this vision of the United States as being responsible to future generations. This generation had a responsibility to future generations, to make sure that future generations did not have to go through the same kind of war that this generation had undergone. He spoke in terms of America's mission to the world. This country was not created simply for its own benefit. This country was created for the benefit of all humanity. We owe something to the world, and what we owe to the world is a commitment to world peace. Western civilization cannot survive another conflict like that through which we have just gone. And the only way to prevent another such conflict is to announce to potential aggressors in advance that if they do commit aggression, they will be punished. And knowing they will be punished, they simply won't take the risk. In every state that Wilson went through, you could almost see public opinion polls were not at all scientific in those days. But reporters followed Wilson on his journey. And they talked to editors who were sort of the next best proxy for what the public is thinking. And all along the way, you could almost see this trail of support for the League of Nations and the Treaty of Versailles. And reporters following Wilson said, it's remarkable how in every state that he has visited, popular opinion has swung around behind the treaty. And it looked as though by the time he had completed his swing around the circle, as such journeys were often called, by the time he got back to Washington, he probably would have outmaneuvered and outflanked Henry Cabot Lodge. But then, in Colorado, on his way back, he suffered a stroke. And this magnificent voice that produced these marvelous words fell silent. He never spoke in public again.